Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute once folks are in. If you're just joining us, we're just giving folks about a minute or so to jump on, and then we'll get started. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and get us kicked off while folks still continue to join. But I know we've got a lot of content to get through and want to make sure we have time for that and for questions. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Controlling Your Own Destiny, a local leader's toolbox for reducing wildfire risk. My name is Melissa Keene. I'm the Director of Enterprise Programs and Special Projects. I will be your host and moderator for today's session. So thank you for joining us. Just a quick overview of our agenda for today. We're just going to do a really quick introduction here to set the stage for the conversation. And then we're going to hear presentations from our three presenters today. We have Dave Winnacker, who is a consultant with RPMG, one of our partners, as well as a retired fire chief from Moraga-Orinda Fire District. And then we are joined by two current folks from the fire district, Jeff Isaacs, who is the fire district chief, and Casey Irving, who is the fire district marshal. So we'll have a conversation this morning around this topic, around your toolbox and things that you can use to reduce wildfire risk in your community. And then we will have an audience Q&A, and then we will wrap up and adjourn by 12:30. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. As you joined, you probably noticed that you are muted. You will be muted for the duration of today's webinar just because we've got a pretty large audience joining us, but that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can type questions into that box at any point during today's session. So we'll be tracking that throughout the webinar. We'll be responding to any logistical questions that you might have, and then we will be pulling all of those content questions for that Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. You probably also noticed that we are also recording today's webinar, and that session will be, or that recording will be available along with the slide deck shortly after today's webinar, and you'll receive a link to that directly to your email. Before we jump in, just want to share a little bit of context about ILG in case you aren't super familiar with us. We're a statewide nonprofit that's affiliated with the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work with our affiliates to serve cities, counties, and special districts statewide and provide practical and easy to use resources so that you all as local agencies can more effectively implement policies on the ground. We have four main pillar areas: leadership and governance, workforce development and civics education, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. And in those four main spaces, we provide education and training, technical assistance, capacity building, and convening services for local agencies. So if you aren't, again, very familiar with us, we have a lot of free resources on our website. Please go check that out or reach out to me or one of my team members after the session, and we can definitely share more. And then also just to flag that this is part of an ongoing series of a conversation on wildfire that we are having in partnership with Renne Public Law Group and Renne Public Management Group. This is the third webinar in this series. The first two are archived on our website if you're interested in going back and listening to those conversations. And then the final chapter of this conversation will happen in January, and you can register for that session at any point now. So again, these are the panelists that I'm joined by this morning. Dave Winnacker, who has been our consistent voice throughout this series of webinars, and is obviously an expert in this field. And then today we're also joined by Jeff and Casey to share their expertise and experience in the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. So I'm going to pause here and turn it over to John Holtzman with Renne Public Law Group, who was the architect of this series along with Dave to share just some opening remarks. John?
Good morning. John Holtzman, I'm managing partner of Renne Public Law Group. So we're really excited today by both the content and the folks. Many of you who've been on before have seen Chief Winnacker, who is a real force in this world, but have not been exposed to the two other people who are on the webinar. Jeff Isaacs, who is the current chief of Moraga-Orinda and previously was a fire marshal and is a true expert in the area of fire prevention, and Casey Irving, who is the current fire marshal in Moraga-Orinda Fire District and a real rising star. We're very excited to have her at Moraga-Orinda Fire District. I am also parenthetically the general counsel of Moraga-Orinda Fire District, so this is a family occasion. The content today is in some ways almost the culmination of what we've talked about in the last two rounds. This is really the toolkit, the things you can actually do to bend the curve on a local level with respect to wildfire. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that the toolkit is under fire. I always start everything I say about fire with, like, everybody agrees that wildfire is bad, at least when it affects populated communities. But there isn't a lot of agreement these days about what can and should be done and how much should be done. And the legislature, in the name of a variety of issues like housing, has, and also in quickly rebuilding down in LA, et cetera, has in a variety of ways sought to undercut some of the tools that local governments have. So that's my broader take on this, but I don't want to, we have such great content today and so many great questions waiting. I'll turn it over to Chief Winnacker.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And it's good to see everyone back to join us for the next in this multi-part series. And really the intent of the series is recognizing that there are a lot of different things folks are worried about, and wildfire is not only one of many concerns that local government leaders have, but wildfire, because it is both a longstanding problem. It's noteworthy that the first defensible space laws in California were passed in 1965. So there are enduring long-term elements of the regulatory and policy component of wildfire risk reduction, but there's also very new concerns that have arisen really since about 2017 with the increased frequency of wildland-initiated urban fires, this being fires that are carried from structure to structure, where structures are the fuel most likely to carry the fire. Very different fire than a wildland fire, even though the source of ignition is the same. It's worth noting that PRC 4291, which was the original defensible space law, was passed to protect the grass, brush, and timber-covered lands with economic value in California from structure fires. So it's worth recognizing the degree to which our concern has shifted over time in response to the conditions we've seen on the ground. Melissa, if you could let me share, please, I will share screen and we'll start in on the slide deck. Joined today, as John mentioned, we have Jeff Isaacs, who is the fire chief of the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. Prior to his current role, he was the fire marshal. And prior to that, he was a division chief with CAL FIRE, where, among other things, he worked with the folks in the FRAP office that are responsible for developing the wildfire fire hazard severity zones that both SRA and LRA agencies recently updated. I asked him specifically to join us today, specifically to share some insight into the workings of FRAP and the purpose of the fire hazard severity zone maps, because they're poorly understood, and yet they're present, and they're often used in ways that aren't particularly aligned with what they're developed for. Jeff, if you wouldn't mind introducing Casey and her background, and then we'll get started with the content.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everybody. Jeff Isaacs, fire marshal or fire chief for the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. Introducing my fire marshal, Casey Irving. Casey comes to us with 25 years of service in the different fire agencies. Last 20 years, she has worked in fire prevention, doing many different roles, and she currently serves as my fire marshal for the Moraga-Orinda Fire District.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Outstanding. All right, let's get started here. All right, so we're going to start with just a quick review for those who either were not on the last couple webinars or it's been a minute. We're just going to walk through a quick discussion of the relevant components of heat transfer that are associated with both wildfire and then a wildfire-initiated urban fire and the consequences. And the reason we're going to do that is that it matters which fire you're trying to prevent. If you are a land manager who are trying to prevent crown fires that disturb either habitat, ecosystems, or merchantable timber, then you have a very different view of the world than, say, a local government fire chief, fire marshal, or city manager who is concerned less about the surrounding landscape and more about the threat to the community, to the built environment. I would also note that by demystifying and breaking down the component parts, we can see where there is overlap and where there is divergence, because there are areas in which there are mitigation approaches that have dual benefit, but there are also ways in which these can diverge. And I would argue strenuously that in order to return a fire-dependent landscape to equilibrium, and to be clear, California and almost all of the American West is a fire-dependent landscape. In the pre-European era, 4.4 million acres or 1.8 million hectares burned in California every year. That's what the environment at stasis or equilibrium looked like. And there's no future in which we can maintain equilibrium if we are not able to have a changed relationship with fire. And one of the ways we change that relationship with fire is we change the current coupling between a wildfire and the risk that fire poses to a community, such that we move to a future state in which a community can be in or adjacent to a fire perimeter and reliably avoid loss because of the reduction of vulnerabilities at the points of transition in which a wildland fire is capable of initiating an urban fire. And we'll now walk through what that looks like. So with credit to Jack Cohn and his WUI disaster sequence outlined in the WUI fire problem published in 2008, a precondition for an urban fire is that we have sustained strong winds and we have highly receptive fuels with continuity to the built environment. Given an ignition, we will see rapid fire spread through vegetation under those sustained strong wind conditions and highly receptive fuels. Highly receptive meaning that they are cured, they have a high dead component, they have low live fuel moisture, and they have horizontal vertical continuity to other vegetation, and that vegetation has continuity to the built environment. Given then vulnerable structures at the entry points, i.e. those points at which wildfire arrives at the vegetative edge or has a point of transition into the built environment, we have the potential for firefighting resources to become overwhelmed and become ineffective. Put simply, we have the potential for there being more fire than firefighters at the point of entry. And if that occurs, and there are tightly spaced contiguous structures that are downwind of these points of entry with vulnerabilities, that where fire has arrived at sufficient speed and scale that has outpaced the firefighting response, then we have the preconditions for an urban fire, where we now have structure to structure fire spread, where our firefighting resources, our water supply, all of the things that we have built in our communities to prevent fire from spreading have been overwhelmed. And those fires will burn until the wind stops, or until those fires encounter non-burnable features such as the Pacific Ocean. So the entire discussion here is about how can we reduce the vulnerabilities at the points of entry, and in parallel, because these are complementary approaches, how can we create a varied age class mosaic along the fire pathways that enter our community so that a wildfire is slowed, so that we have more time to evacuate our residents, aggregate our firefighting response. So we have both work in the landscape to slow the fire, and we have work at the points of entry to reduce both the speed and the number of homes that are capable of supporting a wildfire to urban fire transition. And specifically what that looks like, here's an example. We see fire pathways encountering the community. We see a point of transition at the vegetative edge. And then we see the potential for structure to structure spread because we have dense urban structures that are capable of carrying structure to structure ignition, which is generally speaking is about 10 meters. If a structure is within 10 meters of another structure, the risk is coupled, and there is a 100% probability of structural ignition in the absence of a firefighting response, all of the factors being equal, irregardless of the presence of wildland specific mitigations, because this is now an urban fire where a structure is putting off significantly greater flux and measured in watts per meter squared than the equivalent fire load of vegetation. And so what that looks like with regard to mechanisms, we have wildland fire spreading on the ground component. This is vegetative item to vegetative item. We have three-dimensional ember cast where firebrands are carried aloft either by convective lift or by the predominant fire winds, and then are blown into the community. Now, the penetration of these firebrands, the concentration of those matters, and there's a significant decay rate as we get out into the longer range spotting. So as a general rule, 300 to 400 meters, depending on the fuel type, is a good planning figure for ember penetration into the community. And we then have homes igniting, both from ground component up at the edge, at the vegetative edge, and interior pockets, generally said, within 300 to 400 meters of the vegetative edge, we can start to see structures ignite. Those structures are capable of igniting other structures, which can then not only do direct flame impingement, convective and radiant heat transfer to adjacent structures, but those structures can produce embers in their, or firebrands in their own right that can now cause the fire to leapfrog ahead of non-burnable features, such as interior streets. We have structures burning structures, and we can very quickly achieve a breakover point at which there are structures igniting at a faster rate from structure to structure. So node to node, structure to edge to structure, node to edge to node, or from structure to structure via three-dimensional ember cast, skipping over non-burnable features. And that this can then cause us to move into the state, as we've seen in 4 significant fires since 2017, where we had an urban fire. And the primary fuel carrying the fire was structures. And that the 4 fires, going back to 2017, the North Bay fires, the Camp Fire in Paradise, and then the 2 LA fires earlier this year, those 4 fires alone account for 50% of the structures lost in the last 20 years. So were it not for those 4 fires and the urban fire component of them, all the problems we've had associated with large-scale structure loss would be significantly reduced. And within some of these other fires that were not urban fires in their own right, there were instances of urban fire transition, so that the actual count is probably significantly higher. Okay, so with that, as we mentioned in the beginning, the state has passed a bunch of laws, and from those laws have derived a bunch of regulations, some of which are confusing, some of which may appear to be contradictory. And I would argue, net, given the losses of the last several years, either the current laws or the current implementation of the laws has come up short. I think the status quo and the results of the last several years suggest the status quo is not a particularly viable option. And so it is important, we believe, to understand what the existing state laws are, what is required to ensure that you and your agency are in compliance with those state laws, understand the specific authority that has been given to local agencies by the legislator to enact more restrictive measures with regard to wildfire risk reduction to the community. And then we'll talk through some of the reasons one might want to consider doing that, some tools that can be used and are in use within the Moraga-Orinda Fire Protection District to demystify not only the spread of fire, but the wildfire risk reduction measures the community can engage in. And we'll talk about special cases, specifically those circumstances where a modification, where there is a practical difficulty to implementing a strict interpretation of the law, or an alternate means and measures request where a resident believes they have an alternate, perhaps new and emerging, way to achieve the same practical effect. And then we'll talk through the existing state fire hazard severity zone maps and how those are not risk maps and shouldn't be used as such. And lastly, we'll give an update on the ongoing discussions at the Board of Forestry about the pending Zone 0 mandate in accordance with AB 3079 passed in 2020. All right, so first let's start at the general categories of fire safe laws. First are the defensible space requirements. This is vegetation management, initially within 30 feet of a structure, and then in the early 2000s extended to 100 feet from a structure that reside in the Public Resources Code, specifically PRC 4291 for homes that are in the state responsibility area, and Government Code 51182 for homes that are in the local responsibility area. With one significant exception, these two match each other as far as the requirements, and that significant area of deviance is that in the public resource code, government buildings are exempt from the defensible space requirements, and in the government code in LRA, they are not. We'll also talk through the requirement for restrictive vegetation plans for new construction that lives in Chapter 49 of the Fire Code. Talk about land use requirements that are in Title 14 of the California Code of Regulations. Talk about the application of enhanced building code requirements. They're found currently in Chapter 7A of the Building Code and soon to be moved into the WUI Code under Part 7 of the Building Standards Code. And then lastly, we'll talk through the required materials that are referenced under Title 19 of the California Code of Regulations and the Office of the State Fire Marshal's Building Material Listing Service, where those are operationalized and made accessible for local agencies and for residents. So as I referenced, back in the 60s, PRC 4291 was instituted to protect the grass, brush, and timber-covered land with economic value of SRA from structure fires. In 2008, that requirement for 30 feet of vegetation management was extended to 100 feet or the property line, whichever is closer. And I think that's worth reviewing, that if you are a local agency in a suburban or urban setting, there are going to be very few of your parcels that have 100 feet from the structure to the lot line. And so recognizing that the state says the property line overrides what was presumably the fire science, suggesting you needed either 30 or 100 feet. So if you have a structure 5 feet from the property line, the state requirements only require 5 feet of clearance. Even if at the property line, 5 feet from the structure, there exist hazardous conditions that could cause the structure to be ignited. And one of the local amendments that many local agencies have enacted that exceed the state requirements are a requirement for an adjacent property owner to carry out defensible space fuel management to create the defensible space for a structure on an adjacent parcel as one of the opportunities that exists for a more restrictive standard. It's also worth noting that in 2008, when the defensible space requirements were extended from 30 feet to 100 feet, the CEQA exemption was not also expanded. So there is CEQA coverage as a categorical exemption for defensible space work done within 30 feet of a structure. But for there to be a CEQA CADX to 100 feet, the local agency needs to submit the appropriate documentation to the county clerk, supported by a finding of fact for the notice of exemption. So you have to file an NOE if you are requiring work to 100 feet and you want to have a CADX for it. Of note, existing state requirements for defensible space are essentially fuel should be maintained in a manner not capable of readily transmitting fire. That is what is in the PRC and 4291. And there's a little extra language about the can't be dead material in trees or vegetation or structures that can't be duff and litter on the roof or in the gutters. And stovepipes and chimneys have to have 10 feet of clearance from adjacent vegetation. In 2020, AB 3079 was passed, directing the Board of Forestry to establish a regulation creating a zone 0, a 0 to 5 foot ember resistant zone. And the legislation stated that the regulation would be published no later than January 1st, 2023. Following the LA fires, an executive order was issued directing the Board of Forestry to complete the regulation, and the Board of Forestry is currently holding hearings in an attempt to meet the EO mandate of publishing a zone 0 requirement no later than the end of this calendar year. Noting how late in the year it is, I think that is an open question, but it's worth noting that there is zone 0 regulation will be forthcoming with an effective date for existing properties of 3 years from the date the rule is published. So in 2029, there would be a zone 0 requirement kick in. Of note, with a local agency's ability to adopt more restrictive, one of the ways in which you can be more restrictive is to advance the effective date. So when the Board of Forestry publishes the regulation, one of the local amendments that could be made would be to implement zone 0 at an earlier date before the 2029 state mandate in SRA and LRA, very high fire hazard severity zones. Of note, in SRA, any fire hazard severity zone, so moderate, high, or very high, is required to comply with defensible space. In LRA, defensible space is only a requirement for existing structures in very high fire hazard severity zones. And 7A, Chapter 7A construction is required in high and very high, and that if a home is built under 7A, if that's triggered, that 7A includes a requirement for defensible space. But it's worth noting that there is a deviation with regard to the extent of where defensible space is required in SRA and LRA, with one being required everywhere, in SRA and LRA only requiring defensible space in very high. Extending the area in which defensible space is required is yet another example of a local amendment that can be made, so that the requirements would be the same, but they could be applied in a broader extent of the community to meet the local conditions. So next we talk briefly about what Chapter 49 requires, which is when there is new construction in a very high fire hazard severity zone LRA, or any construction in the SRA, one of the things that is required under Chapter 49 is that there be a vegetation management plan, and that the vegetation management plan and the associated fire plan includes not only how you access and water and all the other sort of normal building code things, but it includes specific requirements for new vegetation. So the species, the configuration, the maintenance, and the maturity. And I think it's worth noting that when there is a vegetation management plan as a condition of approval for the permit, that's binding. And I don't think this is well understood, and certainly in practice, this isn't well enforced, that once a home is approved with a vegetation management plan, any alterations to the vegetation management plan have to be approved, because we're now deviating from the conditions of approval. So Chapter 49 for a number of things, but also with specificity, the requirements for not only what must be included in vegetation management plan, but the types of plants, the list from which the plants that are approved can be planted, the separation between those plants, and the manner in which they will be maintained. Chief Isaacs, I'll hand it to you if you wouldn't mind talking us through Title 14 and the state minimum fire safe regulations.
Thank you, sir. As Chief Winnacker said, my background, I spent 22 years with CAL FIRE. I helped create CAL FIRE's land use planning program, oversaw the SRA fee, land use planning, and the pre-fire engineering program. So one of the things that I had to become familiar with was the Board of Forestry and their Title 14 and how that applies to the local responsibility areas as well as state responsibility areas. So Title 14 is the regulations through the Board of Forestry, and it is their way to get fire safe regulations into the state responsibility areas. There's a lot of questions on whether the Board of Forestry has the authority to enact their regulations in local responsibility areas. That was given to them by the legislator. The legislator has taken their modification or their regulations and now, applied it to LRA. So the areas that the Board of Forestry really hits and touches on are the ingress and egress for new developments and structures, the signing, building numbers, address, emergency water supply, and something that we're starting to see, especially coming up January with the WUI code, is the building setbacks. Setbacks we're going to see in the new WUI code. It's taken from Title 14, and it's going to allow the fire agencies to now weigh in and have to approve setbacks in the very high fire hazard severity zone. So it's going to cause the fire agencies to work closely with the planning departments to make sure the setbacks are correct and the field modifications are correct.
Just note with setbacks, there will be tension here within the local agency space, because setbacks also result in lower building density, and so there's a desire to increase density. That said, setbacks are one of those elements in which there are alternate means and measures that can achieve the same practical effect. So if we are increasing density, well, we can engineer similar wildfire and structure-to-structure resistance with rated walls and other means to achieve the same effect. As I said, if a structure is within 10 meters of another structure, there is a certainty, given normal construction features, that structure A will ignite structure B, or vice versa, under an urban fire condition. There are engineering approaches that can achieve the same practical effect with regard to structural ignition resistance, which is pretty standard building code stuff with regard to features we require in other settings. This is just a slightly different use case. So with Chapter 7A, so to be clear, this is Chapter 7A of the Building Standards Code. It includes, this applies in fire hazard severity zones in SRA and high and very high fire hazard severity zones in LRA. And while this is part of the Building Standards Code, both the existing 7A and the future Part 7 of Title 24, when the WUI code comes into effect in January, by reference, defensible space requirements for both PRC 4291 and Government Code 51182 are included by reference. So if you're in a 7A or WUI code requirement, you bought defensible space as well. And that's important to recognize that defensible space would not otherwise be required in a high fire hazard severity zone in LRA. So this is different. And if it's an infill setting where this is either new construction or a major remodel that the building code official has classified as new construction, you will end up with isolated homes that have a different defensible space requirement than the surrounding structures, because it was the trigger of 7A that instituted the need for defensible space in these areas, even though the neighbors are not required to have them. And so as referenced in the beginning, this is a great place that if a person has a practical difficulty in carrying out the code requirements, you can engage in a modifications process. So initiated by the person who's applying for the permit. And it's essentially a negotiation between the code official and the applicant for, if you cannot do this thing that is required by the code, what alternatives can we use to get to the same practical effect? And so a great example of modifications would be if you had a steep slope where the removal of existing vegetation at a large scale could result in soil instability and the sedimentation of surface waters, which would be a CEQA violation. So then we have a practical difficulty. And so then a negotiation would ensue to determine, okay, what could be done with regard to vegetation management on this slope, consistent with the geologic conditions that could cause soil instability. And then having figured out what the limits are on how much vegetation can be removed or what type of vegetation could be used in lieu of the existing vegetation, what additional building components could be put into effect, either a rated wall or something like that, to achieve the same practical effect. So modifications are something we can use when there are practical difficulties. And in this space, those are often either one associated with environmental concern. So the impact to habitat or the take of rare, special status, or endangered species, or soil instability and the potential for sedimentation of surface waters. A second means here, or thing here, related but slightly different, is the use of AMMRs. And so this is where an applicant believes they can achieve the same practical effect through a different approach. And so if you hear a discussion about new and emerging science, then AMMR would be an excellent opportunity for a person or an applicant, permit applicant, to say, I think I have a better way of achieving the same practical effect. And to include, when you go into the relevant section of the code, there is a lengthy list of ASTM, ECHO series tests, or NFPA, et cetera, a series of tests that can be used to validate that this alternate means and measures, either the material or the method assembly or both, have the same practical effect and can pass the same test standard. And the reason I think this one is important to reference is that when a resident objects that they're unable to do these things or they don't want to do these things, there's a very easy answer under existing programs that have been in the code, the fire code in this case, for years, just for decades for that matter, to say, okay, this is how the modification of practical difficulty, or an AMMR, if you have a better way of doing it, with test results that the code spells out in great detail, how you can ask for test results and how appeals can be filed, et cetera. All of these can be done for a number of reasons, to include if there is a CEQA concern. And certainly My experience working in the fire district, and I speak for Chief Isaacs and Fire Marshal, that when you hear someone saying that I have a concern, this is an excellent way to route that concern to a productive and well understood process to address it. Jeff, you mind talking through the BML and Title 19?
Yeah. So California Code of Regulations Title 19 authorizes the state fire marshal to maintain the building material list. This is a list that provides approved building materials for the construction industry and contractors to use when they're building that 7A, what is currently 7A compliant, but will be the WUI code standards. It provides a list of the approved materials that it meets the WUI construction requirements. It's updated regularly based on new materials being brought into the market. One of the examples that I can think of the new materials is the ember-resistant vent mesh that we give away here in the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. As we started to look at that product, it wasn't recognized by the state fire marshal's office, but the owner of the company did the appropriate testing, and it is now listed in there. Yeah. Anything else, Chief, you wanted me to cover on that?
I appreciate it. And I just think this is worth being aware of, because when people ask, how do I do this, or what materials can I use, et cetera, the website's easy to navigate. There's a PDF. You see the screenshot of the cover there that can be downloaded. It's an excellent place to point residents, contractors, builders for how they can comply with these various things. It's also a tool that you can use when a resident is voluntarily carrying out retrofits that are not otherwise required because they're not involved in a permit required event. You can point them to the BML for examples of approved material that the state fire marshal has tested and is certified to meet the WUI code or the method of assembly. It is worth noting, however, that both the code and this list do not include intumescent coatings. So paint, sprays, etc., which there are often a lot of questions from residents about. Not included in the section. These are things that are either inherently fire resistive or are ember resistant in the case of dimensional lumber for decks, and have been found to be approved for use. So an excellent place to point people as they're seeking more information about how they can comply. And I'll note, I pulled this down just the other night, the current iteration was updated September 2nd of this year. So this is a living document, and the folks at the Office of State Fire Marshal are regularly updating it. All right, so some things to talk about why you might consider adopting more restrictive measures. So first of all, let's take a look at the legal authority. So in SRA, for a fire district or an agency outside of a municipality that has SRA lands within their local agency authority, and in LRA, there is specific authority given for local agencies to adopt more restrictive measures. So in relevant part from Government Code 51175 Charlie, it is not the intent of the legislator enacting this chapter to limit or restrict the authority of a local agency to impose more restrictive fire and public safety requirements as otherwise authorized by law. I would note that 51175 Bravo also states that as it applies or as it is used in the California Constitution, wildfire is not a municipal affair, meaning that the state minimums absolutely apply in LRA. However, the state minimums are exactly that. They are a minimum. They're a floor, not the ceiling. And where local conditions suggest additional, more restrictive or more progressive requirements make sense, you are explicitly authorized to enact more restrictive supported by a substantial finding of fact. And then in SRA, which to be clear, the state responsibility area is as outlined in the early parts of the Public Resource Code. The state responsibility is the area where the state has the primary fiscal responsibility for the prevention and suppression of fire. And per an attorney general ruling or opinion in 1984, primary does not denote exclusive. So while in SRA, the state has the primary fiscal responsibility, a local agency, specifically any county, city, or district, may adopt ordinance or rules or regulations to provide fire prevention restrictions or regulations that are necessary to meet local conditions of weather, vegetation, or other hazards. Such ordinances, rules, or regulations may be more restrictive than state statute to meet local hazard conditions. And so and of note there in SRA, where the state fire safe minimums also apply, that when there is a conflict between two statutes, the more restrictive shall apply. So if PRC 4291 is less restrictive than a local ordinance, rule, or regulation, the more restrictive ordinance, rule, or regulation shall apply in that area. Now, on a practical purposes or practical means, that can get a little funky where CAL FIRE is out conducting LE 100 inspections in SRA to the PRC 4091 standard, vegetation not capable of readily transmitting fire. And a local agency, specifically a fire district, is also conducting defensible space inspections to a more restrictive standard. That is confusing to residents. And so it would suggest that's a place where some coordination and a conversation with your local CAL FIRE partners about the standard you are enforcing, the reason why, the authority to do so, and then to work out a system whereby either CAL FIRE is not conducting inspections in that area to their standard, which would then create confusion, or as we did in the fire district for years in the SRA portions, those inspections are being carried out in a coordinated and combined manner so that the CAL FIRE defensible space home ignition zone inspector with all of their expertise is there with the local agency inspector, and together they are presenting united front with the local agency who has regulatory authority in SRA doing the talking about what is required, and the CAL FIRE DSI HIZ inspectors sharing general information about the manner in which fire would transmit across the landscape and could threaten the structure in question. So a little bit of deconfliction can go a very long way there, because it is not unreasonable for a resident to say, hey, wait a second, 2 firefighters visited me and said 2 different things, and I'm not sure which one is right. All right, so once you have made a determination that you are going to adopt more restrictive standards as allowed by the legislator, the next step is to complete and adopt a finding of fact. And a finding of fact, which will show evidence of local wildfire risk factors or local hazardous conditions, should include the following: a discussion of the vegetation that is dominant in your area, a discussion of the weather, particularly things like a Mediterranean climate where you have months without rain, particularly if those months without rain culminate in the fall with the onset of Santa Ana, Diablo, Fern, Chinook winds, dry winds from the northeast with high wind speeds and low relative humidity. That's certainly relevant. And if that weather is in alignment with the local topography, i.e., if you see a northeast wind, if you have valleys, canyons, draws, etc., aligned on a northeast to southwest axis, such that you have alignment between the fire weather winds, now you start to have all of the conditions for alignment of topography, weather, and fuel that are capable of generating and sustaining fast-moving wind-driven fires that are associated with structure loss. Next would be a review of sources of ignition. If you're in a Mediterranean county of California, 97% of your fires are anthropogenic in origin. They're started by humans. So an excellent discussion of sources of ignition would look at where there is human activity, where there are recreational areas, where there are freeways with potential for roadside ignitions, where there are railroad tracks, there's industry that carries out work that could cause ignitions, or general human activity. If you're in a mountain area, up in the Sierras in particular, 75% of your fires are caused by lightning. So there's a discussion about where the frequency and the areas that have been historically subjected to lightning strikes. Would be an excellent discussion about sources of ignition and their distribution. And lastly, and the proof's really in the pudding here, is what's your fire history? When have fires occurred? Where have been the ignition sources? What have been the conditions under which those damaging fires spread? So in the case of the Eastern Bay Area, those fires pretty famously are 1923 Berkeley Hills Fire, most destructive fire in California history at its time, and 1991, the Oakland Tunnel Fire, also the most destructive fire in state history at the time it burned. So taking a look at the fire history, the conditions under which those fires occurred, the sources of ignition, and the manner in which the fire spread, excellent reinforcement to the first 4 points with regard to a finding of fact to support more restrictive fire safe measures. So as an example of what that would look like for a particular geography, take a look at what are, from the historical record, what are the fire weather winds? So we're looking at, in this case, the last 10 years. What are the periods within the last 10 years that live vegetative fuels were cured and capable of carrying fast moving fire? When were there sustained dry periods? So now we're down selecting another 10%. And when did those 3 prior events occur during a sustained dry wind event? So we have cured fuels, we have a sustained drying period, and then we have sustained dry winds. Those are conditions under which you could see a rapidly spreading fire. And in this particular geography, we see a northeast and east, that'd be a Santa Ana, and then we see a west where maritime influence is being overwhelmed. The moist air that typically comes off the ocean is being overwhelmed by the desiccating effect of a hot landscape. So this would be your weather assessment, and the frequency that these occur and their duration would start to inform the potential for fire spread. Then we take a look at the fire history. What are the fires that have burned in this particular area in the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years? And what were the conditions under which they burned? And then lastly, we would take a look at what is the potential for fire spread from an ignition area, source of ignition, under these weather conditions. What is the potential for fire spread, and how could that fire encounter the built environment? And if there were vulnerabilities at the built environment, form a point of transition where a wildland initiated urban fire could be ignited. And then lastly, once we have an urban fire and we have structures burning, what is the potential extent of this urban fire spread? And then what is the benefit of associated defensible space, home hardening, or other measures, more restrictive fire safety measures that your local amendment or your local ordinance, rule, or regulation would impose? So we can then we match the history, we match the sources of ignition and the way the topography, fuel, and weather could come together to create fast moving fire. We validate that with the fire history, and then we walk through the manner in which that fire could be damaging. And as you see on the right, the manner in which mitigations that, as required by your rule or regulation or ordinance, could be effective at changing those outcomes. All right, so next we'll take a look at the tools for demystifying. So I asked Chief Isaacs to talk about tools that they're using in the fire district to make residents aware of a couple of things. One, what is the fire threat? It is a common occurrence for residents to speak with great certainty about what a fire is going to do. It is also common that great certainty is absolutely disconnected from the physics of heat transfer and fire spread and the historical fire regime in an area. This is not an area where everyone gets to be an expert. There is specific, there is math, there is experience, there are immutable laws of heat transfer that apply. So first is let's demystify what fire is likely to do. Second, let's make folks aware of what they can do as residents, make them aware of what the fire district or the local agency is doing. And lastly, try to show them the way in which all of this can be brought together into an all risk. So we start accounting for evacuation and other factors here, and how all of these things work together. So the actions of surrounding landowners, the actions of residents, so to create that varied age class fuel mosaic on the surrounding landscape, and to create homes that are prepared to receive fire in the landscape, the actions of the fire district or the fire department, and the response that is going to be unleashed to put the fire out, the work that our law enforcement partners are doing to support evacuation at community-wide scale, and then lastly, what the ongoing maintenance efforts are for how we can not only reduce ignitions, but we can reduce the consequence of those inevitable ignitions. So Chief Isaacs, you wouldn't mind talking us through some of the things you all have done in the fire district?
Yes, sir. So one of the things Chief Winnacker and I encountered our time together here in the fire district was a lot of residents were saying, I have special status species, I have protected plant species, CEQA won't allow me to do defensible space work or remove the hazardous vegetation. You can't make me do this. And it was kind of an area as fire service professionals that was outside our wheelhouse. So Chief and I partnered with Sequoia Ecological Consulting, and we created a best practice for environmental protection during wildfire risk reduction activities. This looked at several areas. We looked at habitat, land cover. We looked at animal species, rare plants, and invasive plants. And we created a map, this booklet that you see there that's available on our website. So as my inspectors would go out and encounter residents and encounter these types of questions, or Chief and I would get phone calls, we could focus people back to this, and it gave them the best management practices from environmentalists, from biologists. And it was very educational for our citizens who were under the impression that, hey, I can't do any work in these type of environments. And this booklet helps guide them and gives them the best management practices. It's not all the management practices. We always recommend, if they have additional questions, that they reach out to our consultant or they go find their own consultant. One thing that we did find in the East Bay Hills is we have critical and core whipsnake habitat. We were able to conduct a fuel break that treated over 3,000 acres, treatable acres, and core critical habitat using the best management practices to protect the species, the plant species, and everything else, while at the same time protecting our community from encroaching wildfire. So we thought this was an extremely beneficial tool that we gave to our residents to be able to help them answer those questions and guide them to make their properties fire safe.
I would note in that picture that you see on the right with the BMP field guide, that's an area that had previously been decadent scrub, and that we had been able to restore that to a native grass meadow, one of very few native grass meadows in the East Bay. And then on a episodic basis, got back in to get low intensity beneficial fire on the ground, hold back encroaching brush, really create a beneficial regeneration environment for those native grasses. And as Dennis Rain, who oversaw the reseeding of this, it was the native grass soil erosion mix with, in his words, a couple of handfuls of wildflower seeds. And you created this beautiful native meadow with seasonal flowers that has now become a haven for pollinators and other things. So you see some really beneficial outcomes with regard to not only wildfire risk reduction, but environmental benefits as well. And tying into that BMP, then we also have the La Morinda Residence Guide developed by the CERT team in conjunction with the relevant fire agencies and law enforcement that ties the not pre-wildfire, but during wildfire. What are things you can do once the fire has begun? And then lastly, as you see on the left there, developed a series of FAQs around how do you comply with defensible space? How do you comply with the fire code? What do you do if you're going to sell a property, either an AB 38 transfer requirement, or in the fire district, there's a local amendment that's going back to 2019 requiring certification of compliance at time of sale, and then how modifications in AMMRs work as well, and then an open discussion about Zone 0 as it evolves. So really thinking through, like, if residents have questions, so do other residents, and how do we capture these in a way that make them readily available? And in the case of the best management practices, how do we demystify access to what can be done? And I think for those of us who have been in the space, certainly if you've done a large scale fuel break, you're very casual about, oh, just call an environmental consultant and they'll tell you what to do. Well, your average resident doesn't know what an environmental consultant is or how to call one. And so being able to make this information available at scale, it was just one less barrier that residents had to be able to do the work. And then as you see in the bullets up top, we want to tie what's being done. We got to start with explaining what local fire conditions are and what are the characteristics under which it's going to spread. The wind event that's going to carry it, the duration, the direction, et cetera. What are the sources of ignition? So what is a likely fire we're going to see tied to fire history? Explain how specific mitigations that are required are by your local amendments, how those match to those local fire conditions, and when taken in the aggregate, are likely to significantly reduce the probability of ignition. From the recent Zone Zero hearings, I very explicitly remember a resident of Los Angeles say, the fire jumped to 10-lane freeway. I don't see how 5 feet is going to make a difference. And look, I get it. That is not an unreasonable question to ask. And when you break that down, say, well, okay, when fire is jumping a freeway and there are receptive fuel beds on both sides of the fire, a single ember crossing the freeway that finds a receptive fuel bed, which is essentially everything in the vegetative landscape in January on a rainless year, is going to start a new fire. But when there is defensible space that reduces the fire line intensity, the ground component fire, and that embers are bouncing off the home hardening retrofits, specifically the vents and the Class A roof covering and the covered gutters, and embers are bouncing off of that, then 5 feet, removing the receptive fuel bed at the base of the structure, fundamentally changes the probability of ignition from firebrands or embers. And so you're comparing apples to oranges in the case of the freeway. Let's get this back to an apples to apples discussion about the vulnerabilities to ember attack at a structure and how Zone Zero will match that. So we then start to bring to that third point. There are specific mechanisms of heat transfer and ignition, and mitigations can have an effect on those specific mechanisms of heat transfer and ignition. And let's start to match them, to break this down into its component parts. Rather than it being a big wall of fire that's going to come down and eat homes, let's break down the specific component parts and let's match the mitigations to show how the mitigations are effective against a specific mechanism of heat transfer, and then how in the aggregate they start to become effective against many forms of heat transfer, recognizing that none of these things are 100% certain, but they don't need to be. Because if we can bring down the risk such that the residual risk is low enough that your firefighting response will pick it up, right? So that we get back to Jack Cohn's WUI disaster sequence, we get to the point that homes are igniting at a slower pace than the firefighting response is aggregating. We can show that, yes, there will be a possible ignition in this edge case, these outliers, and your fire department will put them out. But this is all about removing the scale and reducing the speed with which homes are igniting below the speed with which firefighters are responding. And then to that last point, don't ignore environmental considerations, because they are a thing and people will be concerned about them. There'll be people who in good faith are concerned, and there'll be people who out of convenience believe that by saying environmental conditions, that removes any obligation they have to carry out mitigation. Jeff and I famously encountered several assertions of habitat on small residential parcels. And our response to that was excellent. Please contact California Fish and Wildlife so that your protected habitat can be enrolled. And suddenly you discovered that perhaps it wasn't in fact habitat. And in fact, it was just an old woodpile that need to be mitigated. So there are very real mechanisms for addressing these things, and there are best management practices under which work can be carried out to a certain standard under certain conditions, and those should be addressed and demystified from the beginning so that residents know what you know. All right. So how does this work with regard to modifications in the MMRs? We talked about that earlier. Here's an example from the Moraga-Orinda Fire District where the modifications were demystified by creating a simple online form. So that if a resident said, hey, I believe that either I have a practical difficulty or I have a better way of doing it, here's the way I can carry it out. Here's where my house is. Here's what I would like to have done. Here is the inspection that caused me to believe that I have a requirement to this and I can't. And just simplify this, because I think it's worth recognizing that your plan check folks, your fire marshals, your planning department, et cetera, they're used to dealing with architects, with contractors, with professionals that are in this space all the time and are probably standing at the counter waiting to be served. We now start to apply a well understood and long used mechanism of addressing things to a different population that has a different use case and has a different experience level. So create a form, create mechanisms to access these tools in a way that can meet them where they are and simplifies it. So they don't have to go digging for an obscure form. They don't have to have a bunch of questions about filling it out. Each one of these are associated with a FAQ that explain how it can be done. Make this easier for the residents to do. And our position was always, look, if there's a reason you can't do this, no problem. Tell us why, and then tell us what you propose doing in to achieve the same practical effect. Or look, if you have a better way of doing this, I would love to hear about it. And if your AMMR is good and it makes sense, then let's share it. Let's put it on the list of our FAQs and let others take advantage of that same AMMR if it achieves the same practical effect. We are agnostic of how we get there. We are diligent to ensure we're not requiring residents to carry out violations of CEQA or other regulations. And we are eager to share best practices as folks come up with a better way in doing business. Let's share that. And I would be thoughtful about the fact that you have a fundamentally different population participating in the space than are using your existing modification and AMMR processes underneath the fire code for construction and other uses. So Jeff, if you wouldn't mind, would you talk us through from your time at FRAP or working with FRAP and with the wildland fee folks about what the intent was and is behind the state fire hazard severity zone maps?
Yes, sir. So when we created the state's land use planning program, it was based on fire hazard severity zones and LRA, and specifically the very high fire hazard severity zones. So a bunch of firefighters had to go learn what hazard severity zone maps were, and we had to learn the difference between a hazard and a risk. So the fire hazard severity zone maps were driven by Assembly Bill 337, better known as the Bates Bill. It came out of one of the results of the tunnel East Bay Hills fire back in 1991. It required the state to create maps on a statewide basis for all state responsibility area, but local responsibility area that was now deemed as very high fire hazard severity zone. So a big difference between the hazards and the risks. We can't reduce our hazards, but we can reduce our risk. So reading from the state's original handout, hazard refers to a physical condition that can cause damage. Hazard, as calculated in the model, is based on the physical conditions that give a likelihood that an area will burn in the future. The heat produced when it does burn and the prediction of embers that may spread the fire. It is based on a potential vegetation that will grow in the area over the next 30 to 50 years. Risk, on the other hand, is the potential damage a fire can do to values at risk in the area under existing and future conditions. Risk does consider modifications that affect susceptibility of property to damage from a fire. So that was one of the big things that we had to realize going into the land use planning program and everything. What were those the differences between that hazard and the risk? And the folks at CAL FIRE at the time that built those maps were found in CAL FIRE's FRAP, or Fire and Resource Assessment Program. They are the GIS specialists and the fire scientists that can analyze that data. Some super great folks in there and some really smart people work in that program to create those products.
And I would just note, Jeff, as Jeff mentioned in passing, that with the hazard severity zones, it does not matter what mitigations you carry out. Your hazard is your hazard. And the purpose of the hazard severity zones is to tell you where those state fire safe minimums and laws apply. That's it. That's the purpose. It's a land use planning tool. A risk map, on the other hand, is far more dynamic and can show the value of mitigation, so that in a risk map, you can bring down your risk. And one of the challenges here has been just sort of lack of understanding or misunderstanding of the purpose. And then the second is the use. And I can tell you, because these are publicly filed rate plans that anyone can read, the insurance industry does not use the fire hazard severity zone maps for their pricing or their underwriting decisions. They use CAT models, a catastrophe model, a much more sophisticated approach that produces an average annual loss output denominated in dollars, AAL, per million in total insured value, or TIV. So when there's a discussion about hazard severity zones, there's often a sort of a, hey, we don't want to be put in that zone, is the initial response from the community. And I would argue, if you were thoughtful about it, it's the other way around. If you are in an area that has wildfire risk, and that's most areas for that matter, you absolutely want to be put in a fire hazard severity zone, because that would require any future construction to be built to a higher standard, a fire resistive standard, ember resistant specifically. And that as new construction is built to that higher standard, that buffers the existing homes. And in some ways, if you are an existing homeowner, your worst case scenario is to be in an area with fire hazard that is not classified as such, because that means all the future construction, either new construction or major remodels classified as new construction in your area, will be built to that lower standard, meaning those homes will form a risk to you because they are now more susceptible to ignition. And as we've talked about with those 4 fires reflecting 50% of the losses in the last 20 years, those are urban fires. That is, structures is the fuel most likely to carry the fire. And that if those structures have vulnerabilities, those structures are more likely to carry the fire to your home. So you should be clamoring for inclusion in a higher fire hazard severity zone that would trigger the state's more restrictive fire safe minimums, so that the homes around you would protect your home from essentially the oversight that allowed your home and others around you to be built to the lower standard, notwithstanding the fact that you are in an area with a high risk of wildfire. So lastly, we'll talk through, I'm sorry, there's the example, one slide off. Just as an example there, you can see in the East Bay with the new maps, one of the things that was added is the in LRA, in the local responsibility area, under the old maps published in draft in 2007 and finalized in 2009, there was no high or moderate fire hazard severity zone in LRA. With the new maps that were issued various times throughout this year and then adopted by local agencies and submitted back to CAL FIRE, there is now, not only did the old zones get moved around and adjusted based on new models and so forth, but the LRA had 2 additional zones added, that being specifically the moderate and the high in LRA that previously didn't exist. So you see a really significant change from the old maps to the new or the current maps. That has less to do with the lines moving and more to do with new layers were revealed with regard to LRA. On the right there, you see an example of in the East Bay of both the SRA and LRA moderate, high, and very high fire hazard severity zones, with the LRA very high being shown in sort of that pink due to the filter that's being turned on. By legislation, these maps are updated every 5 years. That's the legislative requirement for their update. I would note the old maps were published in 2009 and then most recently updated in 2025. So something less than a 5-year frequency, but there were some issues such as the Forest Mortality Task Force and some other one-off things that caused such a delay between the last maps and these maps. And then lastly, I'd say, just as referenced before, with regard to risk reduction activity being reflected, one of the, besides type conversion, when you see, and by that I mean land use conversion, right? So one of the biggest changes from the 2009 maps to the 2025 maps with regard to risk is that where there had been new construction. So if previously it was grass, brush, or timber, and now it's a golf course community, that pulls the fire hazard severity zone back towards the vegetative edge, because the vegetative edge has moved farther out. So you see construction and new development made a change. There were some changes with regard to areas that were previously SRA that are now LRA because of their incorporation or development. But the other element of risk reduction activity that is reflected besides building is grazing, and prescribed grazing is one of the few mitigations that's considered enduring, because as Jeff mentioned, the maps are drawn in a manner that considers risk over the next 30 to 50 years. So if you cut a fuel break, say in 2019, and there are elements of that fuel break that are not being maintained, if that were cut in grass, there is no residual value to that fuel break 1 year later. And next year's grass crop comes in, and it's as if that fuel break had never been cut in that grass fuel model. If you're in brush, either a grass shrub or a shrub fuel model, you're generally 4 to 5 years before the vegetation returns. Or if, depending on the type, if this were, say, an old ridgetop fire break, bare mineral soil, you actually could see a type conversion from brush to grass, where you'd have, by the next year, what had previously been brush is now grass. And you get little or no residual value. But in brush, assuming brush is growing back, within 4 to 5 years, the fuel will have rebounded to its pre-fuel break state. And if you're in timber with understory thinning or selective thinning and ground fuel removal, it's 10 to 15 years, give or take. And then that fuel break no longer has value. If it hasn't been maintained, it grows back. And the fire hazard severity zone maps assume that fuel breaks will not be maintained and that will grow back. Therefore, other than grazing or new construction, the fire hazard severity zone maps don't reflect fuel treatment on the landscape. And lastly, talk about zone 0. So the idea of zone 0 is born out of ember-caused structure losses where there was defensible space. There were other mitigation measures that decoupled that structure from the ground component of fire, yet the structure still burned. And so the idea of zone 0 is to create an ember-resistant zone, and that is since morphed into an ember-resistant and ignition-resistant zone. And really from top to bottom, that looks like a Class A roof covering or assembly, which the good news is almost every roof in California already. It is screened gutters or gutters that are maintained so that the valleys and gutters of the roof do not have dead material, duff and litter, specifically leaves and needles accumulating as required by existing defensible space law. It also means that the vents have been retrofitted, if there are vents present, to either a 1/8 inch or finer mesh or a building material listing approved ember resistant model like a Brand Guard or a Vulcan or other ember specific model, or 1/8 inch or finer mesh, which has the same effect. And that there is an absence of combustible material in the first 5 feet from the structure, so that if firebrands were to strike the house and to fall next to the house, they wouldn't land in a receptive fuel bed. That be grass, that be vegetation litter, that be mulch capable of 4 to 6 inch flame lengths, or other vegetation that can either drop material that could ignite. It could act as a factor, a sticky component where blown tree litter from other areas could get stuck, or the vegetation itself could be caused to ignite either by embers to a receptive fuel bed on the ground to the plant material, or from plants in zone 1 or zone 2 that plant could ignite. And then lastly, wood fences that attach to the fence. There is no shortage of case studies of wooden fences acting as a wick that brought distant fire from an outlying zone or even beyond defensible space zones. And fire walked its way down that fence across the wooden gate that usually connects to the structure and thus ignited the structure. The fence itself burning isn't necessarily a risk factor, but in those last 5 feet, particularly with unboxed eaves, you'll start to see all that heat and the products of combustion start to attack the house at close range and are associated with structural ignitions. So that's zone 0, a removal of things that form receptive fuel beds, things that form vulnerabilities, noting that the roof covering and the vent retrofits are complementary to zone 0, but that falls under the building code and cannot be required as a retrofit. It can be recommended, but not required. A good recommendation to achieve the network effects of the system of having all of the above. So following AB 3079, the Board of Forestry has been, in accordance with the guidance contained in 3079, I should say, the Board of Forestry has been considering a regulation that will enact zone 0. There has been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, fair amount of controversy about whether or not zone 0 is beneficial and whether or not zone 0 is proven science and whether or not zone 0 without associated complementary home hardening would be effective. I would say I have strongly held opinions that zone 0 is highly effective, and that in the absence of zone 0, we will continue to carry forward the current status quo that is associated with unsustainable structure losses. That's my personal opinion. If you have an opinion or you would like to follow the discussions, I would encourage you to visit the Board of Forestry website. They've had and will continue to have a series of public hearings where information is being shared. I will note as an editorial that it is possible in the future that we will have a better scientific understanding of what, if any, plants are okay, under what conditions they would have to be maintained, and whether there are plants that are neutral and do not contribute to the potential for ignition. There are a whole lot of questions about whether the plant itself, whether that plant might be found to be neutral and not a cause of additional risk, but whether the plant then inhibits the maintenance of the ground around it, where things can accumulate or be harder to reach, and then how you would convert that into an inspectable standard. That it is possible that in time we will know more about that. I would editorialize that we know enough now to get started, and saying we need more information, we need more study, is really saying we're okay with the status quo. I would argue the structural losses of the last 10 years suggest the status quo is not okay, and that we need to take a hard look at some more progressive approaches. We'll hold there at the end of the plan discussion. As I mentioned, the executive order, November 18, TAC 25, published earlier in January this year, says that the Board of Forestry must publish the regulation by the end of the year. That's going to be a lot of work to be done, but I'll leave it to the Board of Forestry about their work. And if you're interested, the most recent pleiad available on the website with a number of available options that the board is currently considering. I'd love to hold here and see if we have any questions. And I know a few came in early. We'll try to answer those questions. And why don't we start with the one in the
Yeah, I was going to start
chat.
there too, Dave.
It's a great question.
Yes. So we've had a few questions come in around compliance, so I want to frame this for you all a little bit. So Jeff, there's a question in the chat, if you can't see it, around compliance for your ordinance specifically, as it's stricter than the state laws. And so hoping you can chat a little bit about what your compliance is looking like in the district with your property owners. And then there's been a couple of broader questions that came in ahead of time around general compliance and how can you encourage compliance and work with property owners. So Jeff, maybe we start with you around what it's looking like in your community, and then we can chat a little bit more broadly about any tips you all have to encourage compliance in general.
Sure, I will try to answer that. So is Chief Winnacker and I created these more restrictive defensible space ordinances going back to 2019 and 2020. Our main focus was education. We spent the first couple years really attempting to educate the residents, email, social media, just to get the message out there. And what we found was we weren't having that much success with that. And where success came from for us was unapologetically enforcing the district ordinances. So we created a citation ordinance, and we issued citations. And so we still try to educate first. We do the inspection, we leave information. We find that if we do tell folks the why, that is beneficial. And sometimes that works. Most of the time it doesn't. It's usually the $100 citation that we give first, up to a $200 citation second visit, and then a $500 citation. We see a lot of compliance at the $200. The $100 is kind of, well, I can pay $100 fine and, the fire district's going to go away. It's when they get that $200 that we seem to get their attention. And a lot of times we'll get phone calls that say, whoa, you guys were serious about this. And yes, we are serious about this. And like I said, unapologetically enforce the district ordinances. I don't know, Chief, you got any other comments on that?
Yeah, I think how we got here is important too. So going back to 2019, specifically as part of the triennial fire code update, we sought and got the votes to create a 2-foot non-combustible zone. It's not 5 feet, it's not a full zone zero, but it was the start. And a 2-foot non-combustible zone is, that's not subjective. You either have 2 feet of non-combustible or you don't, as opposed to the state fire safe minimums that say vegetation not capable of readily transmitting fire, which is a very essentially fungible standard. So what we started out doing was an awful lot of inspections over a very broad swath. And we quickly realized that trying to do everything everywhere was just not going to work. The system and the staff were overwhelmed. And then that It diluted the message when we were in too many places. We weren't getting enough compliance to achieve that critical mass, so that people who would have otherwise done the work were pointing to their neighbors who had not yet done the work and saying, well, hey, wait a minute. If they haven't done it, why do I need to do it? Maybe I'm misunderstanding this. If everyone I look around me hasn't done it. So in out years, as we refined, developed, to lick our wounds about what did and didn't work, we came up with a much tighter focus. So I think at our peak, we did over 4,000 inspections with a roughly 50% non-compliance rate on initial inspection. So about half the homes would fail. And at each step of the reinspection and eventually the citation and then subsequently fines, at each step of the process, you got about another 50% of compliance until you get down to the last one or two folks out of a initial sample size of thousands that were just either unable or unwilling to do the work. And then there are a variety of more impactful approaches you can take to include lean funded work. But what we learned out of that was the importance of prioritization. And that really is where the methodology and the framework are the points of transition. So as we looked at the community, we looked at the fire history, looked at the prevailing weather patterns, we landed on, okay, these are the areas where fire is likely to enter the community, and with the ability to explain that. And this is the geographic extent, both the horizontally, the frontage, how much of the community had exposure to the vegetative edge, and then by depth, about how much of the community had exposure to ember wash. And then we also looked at it with regard to evacuation routes. So viewing the community by evacuation basins of, if this area were to start to burn, that impacts all of these folks that are upstream that have to evacuate. So coming up with a thoughtful approach that then started to subdivide the community into conflagration basins or blocks about, if this started to burn, what would be affected by it? What are the mechanisms of heat transfer and ignition, and what's the appropriate extent? And that dropped, Jeff, please check my numbers here. It's been a minute since I thought about it, but we went from 4,000 or so parcels down to around 1,200. Is that roughly in the range?
Yes, sir.
And we established that, look, this is what we have the capacity for meaningful, all four sides of the house, not just a windshield drive-by inspection of the front yard, understanding that we're going to be back multiple times. There's going to be outreach, there's going to be education, there's going to be incentives, there's going to be community pressure, there's going to be pre-citations, there's going to be citations, and then there's going to be fines, right? We have to have all of these off-ramps so that by the time we get down to something where we're issuing citations and associated fines, this person has had multiple opportunities to get this corrected. And to the second question posed, or the third question posed in the chat, what if someone doesn't either have the physical ability or the financial ability to get the work done? We have had multiple opportunities to understand what those limitations are and figure out what they're capable of doing and what resources we can bring to bear. Can we get some neighbors who are able to help? Can we get the CERT folks or the fire safe council or the Firewise folks, or there's some externality we can bring to bear here so that we can move these folks towards compliance. With our goal here is compliance, not to issue citations or to issue fines. And we can do it with enough geographic concentration that we can start to achieve network effects. And really that works on multiple layers. One, we don't have the inspectors driving all over the fire district every day. They're going to a single area. They're more effective when they're a single area. Two, our messaging and our outreach can be concentrated. So we can smother an area with next door posts, with door flyers, with the sandwich boards, with neighborhood HOA meetings, all those sort of things. So everyone knows it's coming and they've had a chance to collectively answer questions. We can also target the area with incentives and to include the chipping program. If we're going to be doing inspections in an area and probably issuing violation notices, that's an excellent place to focus the chipping program, which then increases the efficiency of the chipper because it's just going door to door down the same neighborhood, not bouncing all over town all day long. And then lastly, we can then show the network effects of, if all of these homes in this area do this work to its standard, we start to see a reduction in that neighborhood's risk in a way that isolated inspections or partial inspections are simply not going to be effective. So really the idea was we needed to focus. And then to the point of Chief Lando saying he sees 15% compliance in a Marin's ordinance, my question for that would be, well, what about the 85% that you know are non-compliant with the requirement? You're a local agency. You have an enforcement authority. You have the ability to require compliance. And so if you know that these homes are non-compliant, well, then why aren't you taking it to the next step? And I can think of, out of a sample size of tens of thousands of inspections over the 7 years we were doing this, I can think of one case where there was a bona fide complete inability to pay, and the neighbors were able to find the resources, and some family resources were brought to bear that were able to help that person to get into compliance. I can think of no cases where a resident cited environmental that were habitat that we weren't able to resolve that with Fish and Wildlife or with others. And I can think of no cases where we allowed a parcel to remain non-compliant throughout the process. Some of them took a while. Some of them had multi-year modifications that they said, I need time to do this. But in all of them, we were able to get them into compliance. And noting the time, I'll ask answer the last question here, which is there a mandate to inspect parcels? There is not. There is a mandate to comply, but local agencies are not required to conduct inspections of all the parcels. My question for those who are not would be, what might we hope is going to change if we're not the ones carrying out those inspections?
Thank you for that. So on the compliance question, just to close the loop there, it sounds like it's a balance of education and enforcement activity as a recommended approach. I'm hoping we can take 30 seconds. There was a number of other questions related to this education and outreach component. And so maybe you guys have all done community outreach and education throughout this process. And so maybe 30 seconds on what is the most effective. So we had a couple of questions around resident fairs and things like that. And what level of information are you sharing? So is there any quick tips you guys can share in terms of starting that broad outreach to your community?
All of the above. And it's only weird if no one shows up. Try them all, have a consistent message, use every mechanism you have. We use resident ambassador, or the fire district resident ambassadors for assessments to share information, Firewise neighborhoods, etc. But ultimately that information sharing is going to have a limit as far as how much actual work will come out of that. And that should be coupled eventually with inspections and enforcement and verification that compliance has been achieved and maintained. I would note that in follow-up out-year inspections, we followed up 50% non-compliance rate on structures that have been compliant the prior year. So the stuff takes work.
Jeff or Casey, any additional thoughts on outreach and what's been effective for you all?
Yeah, two areas that we find the greatest compliance are the property transfer inspections. Those property owners are very eager to get their property into compliance so they can inspect it. And we also take that as an opportunity when a property sold to give a welcome letter to the new residents, explaining to them the requirements and how they must maintain their property. And then we have an ambassador program that Chief Winnacker spoke about. So we created some volunteers and we trained them up, and we use them, neighbors helping neighbors. They are able to go out and they're to provide that information, how to do the defensible space around their home. We separate them from the inspection process. We want neighbors to reach out to these folks to get the information and to know a citation isn't going to follow up after that ambassador comes out there. So those are two ways that we've seen a lot of progress and a lot of compliance.
I love that, neighbor helping neighbor. Find community ambassadors who can help spread your message. So I know we are over time, so thank you for giving us a couple of extra minutes this afternoon. And if we didn't get to your question, I'll share contact information in just a second, and you can follow up with us as needed. But just another flag for the final webinar in this series in January. Registration is open. If you're interested, please go ahead and check out that link. And then if you are not already on our list, definitely join ILG's list to stay involved in upcoming webinars, upcoming trainings on this topic and others. That's our newsletter link and our social media channels. Please connect with us. As a quick reminder, we also were recording today's session, and that will be shared along with the slide deck. And we'll add in a couple of links that the panelists mentioned. If you're interested in learning more, we'll get all of that packaged for you and out in the next few days. And then, as I mentioned, contact information for the folks on the line. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, so please feel free to follow up with us if you have additional questions or comments. And we really appreciate you spending your lunch hour plus with us this afternoon. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Casey, David, and Jeff. Really appreciate you all taking the time to share your experiences on this really important topic. And thank you to everybody on the line again for sharing a part of your day with us. Casey, Dave, Jeff, any closing thoughts before we let everyone go for the afternoon?
Thank you for your interest. Wildfire loss of communities is 100% solvable. We have agency to do so. We just have to decide to use it.
Okay, well, thank you all, and we hope to see you in January on the next one.